Hello and welcome to yet another video. This is the fourth episode of the story in which Naruto accomplished the impossible. You cannot stop the flow of time. Its will only rotates in one direction. A mere human cannot change that path. This story is from Dorsey. Please support him, her. She is also a digital artist, so please visit her profile. Please like and subscribe to show your support. Let's get the show started. The sun was high above the horizon, sending hot beams toward the already weary team. Toraku turned around, resting his eyes on the landscape. Sand was everywhere he looked. The incessant wind carved extreme forms into the soft silky sand, building dunes and enormous mountains from the infinite supply of material. The variation of small waves and high dunes never left the horizon. Only one or two abstract cliffs raised above the golden sea, interrupting the soft curves on the horizon. Toraku turned his head to the other side, now very grateful for his mask as he saw his teammates walking against the wind with squinted eyes. He started to miss the green color of nature. They were marching for 2 days in the golden dust, but aside from a few thousand-years-old trees and some cacti here and there, he couldn't spot any vegetation. He finally spotted something in the distance. Something which was definitely not sand and definitely not the craft of nature. It was somehow too straight, too regular, but still not industrial. He narrowed his eyes and stopped walking, eyeing the thin and straight line on the horizon. Jiraiya turned toward the blonde and nodded. Those are the walls which surround Sunagakure no Sato. We are almost there. It's about time, one more night in this desert and I'll go berserk. A shiver ran through the white-haired Sannin and Toraku smiled back at him in understanding. However, he really liked the nights out in the desert. As the soft sand encompassed his body from the outside, the warm inside the sleeping bag, while the outside world became cold. Somehow, for him, these extreme differences felt familiar, nice. And when he glanced up to the night sky, nothing bothered his sight during his star watch. Toraku let out a weary sigh and closed his exhausted eyes. He hadn't really slept since they stepped into the desert, and when he finally fell asleep he was wandering again in that sewer. He leaned down and slowly stroked his hands through the silky sand, enjoying as the small grains flow out from his palm, pulled by the gravity or picked up by the always blowing wind when he lifted his hands. I know this place. Jiraiya narrowed his eyes and turned back to Toraku. Memories? The teen only shook his head and he leaned down again, gently stroking the sand, like a child playing in the sandbox. A warm smile ran across his face and he closed his eyes, enjoying once more the feeling as the sand ran across his gentle fingers. He finally let out a sigh and straightened himself to turn to his curious companion. Jiraiya in the end only nodded and waved to Toraku to catch up with the others. He slowly turned around again to glance one last time at the endless dunes, then jogged toward the small group. They reached the walls of Suna after 2 hours, and Toraku's feelings that he is in a familiar place increased continuously with each step as they closed the distance between them and the walls. There were no doors, but several guards. Glanced at them with a suspicious look, especially giving high heed to Jiraiya and Toraku. When they almost reached the entrance, a jonin jumped down in front of them, holding up a hand. The small team stayed calm, but still ready to jump if necessary. Jiraiya stepped ahead to the jonin, and handed a small scroll to the shinobi. We are escorting a political envoy from Konoha. You can find every detail in the scroll, so if you will let us pass through the gates that we have an appointment with your Kazekage. The jonin narrowed his eyes, as he slowly opened the scroll, readying it carefully at least 2 times, to finally nod toward 4 men who appeared next to the jonin in a blink. He slowly wrapped up the scroll again and handed it to one of the men. Escort them to the Kazekage. The jonin turned to Jiraiya and narrowed his eyes again at the white-haired man, who let out a frustrated groan. Don't cause any trouble. Maybe you are powerful Jiraiya-sama, but the advantage of home is on our side. Jiraiya only rolled his eyes in annoyance and waved a hand toward their small group. They got through the narrow passage, and when they finally reached the end, Toraku stopped his movement and one of the Suna Jonin almost bumped into his back. Only his fast reflexes saved him from that humiliating situation. The blonde narrowed his eyes as he rotated his head from left to right, unable to place the scene. The round forms of the brown and golden houses, which looked like they were made from clay, the narrow streets and the abstract forms warmed up his heart, and he felt his mouth curved up into a soft smile. Jiraiya narrowed his eyes again, eyeing every movement of the blonde. Maybe Minato was right and he's really from Suna. By his reaction it is more than possible, and aim is only a dead end. One of the Suna shinobi cleared his throat and Jiraiya stopped his wondering thoughts. Kitsunizan. No reaction. Kitsunizan. Kakashi, could you please? A painful and surprised yelp left Toraku's mouth under the mask as he jumped to the side, almost bumped into the same Jonin and glanced down to his side where the small amount of pain came to see the still softly sparkling finger of Kakashi. Why did you do that? It was an order. The silver-haired Jonin shrugged and nodded toward Jiraiya. I don't care. I told you I hate that shit. Jeez. As if to punctuate his words, he snapped the Jonin hard at the top of his head at his last word, who gave an angry look in response while Rin let out a small chuckle. Jiraiya started to massage his throbbing forehead as the two teens started arguing and shouting each other, completely unaware of the amused, irritated, and sniggering Suna shinobi. Jiraiya felt as a vein started to pulse with every heartbeat, and he glanced toward the two boys who were only centimeters from a real fight. Jiraiya moved closer and slapped his hand to the top of the boys' heads, freezing them in their argument. Calm down enough? Toraku glanced at the Sannin with burning blue eyes, who just turned around and let out a weary sigh. When he reached their voiceless companion in white robes, the man just shook his head slowly, watching the two boys as they walked side by side like nothing had happened a minute before. The small delegation continued their trip toward the heart of the village, earning more and more glances from the villagers and the nearby shinobi, who suspiciously glanced toward their Hitayat. They passed through several large and small passages, when Toraku slowed down his steps to stop at a passageway into a narrow alley. Toraku narrowed his eyes and turned toward one of the Suna Jonins. Isn't there a ramen stand at the other side of this alley? The young shinobi gave a confused look and shook his head. No, Kitsunizan. Actually, there isn't any ramen stand in Sunagakure. The boy frowned under his mask, but only shrugged and passed the carefully watching Jiraiya. After a 10-minute walk they were finally facing the main building of the village. The sight of the Kazegake's office warmed up Toraku's heart again as he examined the round building with a lot of small windows on its side. He stepped out from the group and took the lead without any doubts of where he was going. He confidently passed by the great wooden door, earning suspicious and narrow glances from the guards at the two wings. He turned to the left, toward a winding staircase, and stepped onto the first stair, but his confidence suddenly left him. He blinked and turned around to meet with Jiraiya's raised eyebrow and two frowning Suna Jonins on each side of the stairs. I think it would be better if someone else takes the lead. Toraku scratched his neck and let through a groaning shinobi, who led them to the top floor of the building and raised a hand in front of a large, carved wooden door. Stay here until you gain admission. Jiraiya nodded and moved backward together with his small team around their escorted company in white robes. The Jonin didn't leave the room for a while as long minutes slowly increased to half an hour. The Kazekage is playing with us. Toraku groaned and sighed continuously after the first 10 minutes, playing with his clothes, trying everything to while away some time. Then he finally pulled out a small scroll, examining its content and earning suspicious and narrow eyes from their Suna escorts. Don't do that here, brat. Why? I'm bored. Jiraiya rolled his eyes and snapped his hand around the scroll, removing it from Toraku's hands, who let out an indignant snarl and folded his hands in front of his chest. Finally the double doors parted and the Jonin stepped out to the hallway. Admission granted. Follow me. The group slowly entered to the spacious office by the lead of Jiraiya, and the envoy lining up in the background. Toraku slowly turned his head, to examine his surroundings in the office. The office was plain, beside a big desk and some chairs it was with no frills. He spotted their invisible guards inside the room skulking in the walls, in the shadows of a corner, outside the windows. The amount of bodyguards was annoying, so were their tensed muscles and nervous heartbeats. He shook off his annoyance, letting a soft smile cross his mouth when a familiar warm feeling increased inside him as his azure orbs meet someone's back in front of the giant windows. He carefully eyed the man as he slowly grabbed his familiar triangular-shaped white and blue hat and gradually removed it and turned around to face his visitors from the land of fire. Disappointment ran through Toraku's body when he spotted the short and spiky auburn hair and the stern expression of the fourth Kazekage of Sunagakure. He was waiting for someone else. A shiver ran through his spine when his eyes met with the Kage's narrowed ones. Is this supposed to be a demonstration of the fire's power? The Hokage of Konoha is either very brave or very foolish to send one of the Sannin to start a peace talk. Toraku felt his eyes twitch at the statement, but calmed himself. No, actually my presence here isn't connected with your politics nor concerned with Suna Kazekage-sama. The Kage narrowed his eyes as he saw the masked man turn his head toward the Sannin and shifted nervously, then seconds later avert his gaze in shame. I will give audition to the envoy tomorrow morning. Until that time you will enjoy our hospitality near the city center. You are allowed to move in the village with surveillance. My jonin will escort you there. The Kazekage nodded toward a shinobi, who bowed and escorted the team from the office after they politely bowed to him. The leader followed them with stern and narrowed eyes as they were leaving his office. Slowly, he turned around and walked back to the window, fixing his gaze down to the square where the Konoha shinobi appeared after a short minute. Keep an eye on them. Especially Jiraiya and the boy with the fox mask. A shadow disappeared next to the window and leapt toward the nearest rooftop, then disappeared in the shadows. Their room was also furnished austerely, and Toraku couldn't help when his thoughts wandered back to his first room back at Konoha in the heart of the interrogation and torture department. The continuous presence of guards and eyes on his back was also annoying. He let out a weary sigh and leaned flat on the hard bed. They were accommodated to the same room, without any private space. He could easily touch Kakashi on the next bed if he extended his arms. Not that sleeping below the sky was more comfortable, but they at least had space. He let out another weary sigh and turned toward the Sannin. Jiraiya. The Kage said that we are allowed to go out, yes? The white-haired man nodded. You will get enough time to stroll in the village tomorrow. Please. I'm going crazy. I'll be good. The Sannin turned toward the already snoring Kakashi, then Rin, who sent a soft smile and nodded. I'll take care of him. Okay, but not for too long. And don't cause any trouble. Toraku sent a smirk toward Jiraiya and nodded. He straightened himself and grabbed Rin's wrist, almost dragging her toward the door. He slowly opened it and stuck out his head, and faced the guard in front their room. Joninson, we will need an escort to the village. The shinobi nodded, snapped his hands, and two men appeared beside him. Toraku opened the door, but before they could leave the room, he heard Jiraiya shouting. If you do anything idiotic, I'm going to tell the sissy. Toraku gulped and nodded, earning suspicious glances from the jonins. When they finally left the room, Kakashi opened his eyes. Why did you say that around the Suna jonins? To keep some extra eyes on him. Kakashi rolled his eyes and crossed his arms behind his neck to enjoy his nap again. Suna wasn't a place for sightseeing. That was obvious from the first minute they stepped through the narrow alley which separated the village set inside a wide valley from the desert and the continuously blowing wind. Walking on the almost empty streets, however, felt very pleasant for Toraku. Signs of the low economy could be seen everywhere on the streets. While Konoha's streets were full with shops, street cries, even parks, the roads of Suna were as bleak as their rooms. Most of the streets were filled with cobble, missing big chunks here and there. They passed some closed shops, their windows covered with planks nailed into the frame. Despite the difference in the welfare, Suna was the same as Konoha, shinobi crossing the street with genin teams, civilians walking toward their own destinations, and children ran across the streets playing and shouting at each other. They finally spotted a small but nice restaurant, and Toraku almost hopped inside as his stomach gave him away, earning rolled eyes from Rin. When he finally finished the meal, which could have easily been enough to fill 3 people, he let out a satisfied groan. The small girl chuckled and handed a napkin to Toraku, who raised an eyebrow behind his mask. "Your mask, if full of sauce, you know. You should try eating with this thing on your face." "I don't even know why he wanted me to wear this," he muttered while cleaning his mask from the sticky liquid as much as he could. "I'm sure he has got a good reason for that. He never does anything without a purpose." Rin shrugged and stretched, arching her back. "Rinshin. Do you think causing trouble means some training with Bunshin?" Rin gave a wondering face before she answered. "I don't think so, if we found a proper place for that, but no Kage Bunshins, I think. It won't be too good for us if suddenly 100 foreign ninja popped up in Suna." Toraku nodded and grabbed the last 2 pieces of the grilled fish off his plate for later use, then straightened himself and gave a hand to Rin, who chuckled and bowed at the gallant gesture. They stepped out together and almost bumped into a woman with 2 small children. One of the boys eyed him curiously and the other's green eyes fixed on the fishes stacked in his hands. The child slowly pulled on the woman's clothes and pointed toward the food in Toraku's hand. "Can I also get one of those?" The woman slowly shook her head and a sad smile ran across her face. "I'm sorry, maybe next week." Toraku watched the scene as they stepped back to give the family space to pass by. Without a second thought, he slowly stepped closer and crouched in front of the children and held 1 piece of fish to each child. They eyed him curiously when one of them glanced up to his frozen mother and pulled her clothes once more, jolting her out of her surprise. She smiled and nodded toward the boy, who hesitantly grabbed the stick, but in the end his mouth was curved into a thankful warm smile. The smaller boy on his left also stepped forward and gratefully accepted the gift from the stranger. "Thank you, Kitsunizan." Toraku only nodded, not sure what he should say. The woman bowed and gently grabbed the children's hands and headed toward their destination. Rin stepped next to the blonde and they watched together as the cheerful children happily ate the fish, chatting and chuckling until they mixed into the crowd. "You always surprise me." The teen just shrugged, closed his eyes and let out a thin layer of chakra around him. When he found what he was looking for, he waved a hand toward a dark spot in a small alley. A frowning Suna Kunoichi stepped out from the darkness, and she slowly approached them. "Sorry for the inconvenience, but is there a place where I can train?" "Nothing serious, or destructive, of course." The ninja raised an eyebrow and waved her hand to follow. 10 minutes later they reached an open space next to the village walls and sat down with crossed legs in front of each other. "Okay, show me your progress." The blonde ran through the hand seals and an abstract form of a bunshin popped up next to him. It wobbled 10 steps on its thin legs, before landing flat on the ground and popped out of existence. A snort and a loud laugh echoed in the training ground, but it immediately died down when the annoyed Toraku sent a kunai toward the laughing shinobi in the shadows. The weapon passed his head within millimeters and precociously buried up to the metal ring into the hard stone behind him, still glowing with his wind chakra. "No laughing, I'm trying to concentrate here, you know." An annoyed snort left the shadow and a man approached closer to lean onto a thick pole to observe him closer. The chakra was still too much. Rin made a wondering face and she suddenly snapped her fingers. "Make more." Toraku raised an eyebrow and a cheeky smile ran across his face. "How many do you want?" "Around 2,000. Rin rolled her eyes but she smiled at the amused humming voice at their back. Try first to make 10. The blonde ran through the seals again, and this time 10 clones appeared around him, wobbling a little, but this time they are standing more confidently and looked much more like the blonde in front of Rin. Dismiss and then make 20. Toraku frowned, but he performed the exercise obediently, only to repeat one more time. In the end 40 clones stood still in the small training ground, without wobbling, and perfectly copied the caster. Rin nodded with satisfaction and moved closer to a clone, eyeing it curiously. Okay. Perfect. From now on, dismiss them and consecutively make one less. The blonde nodded when he finally understood the method, and a smirk ran across his face. Rin moved next to the Suna Jonin and sat down to eye the process from a distance. After an hour, and 30 clones less, Toraku heard the soft breathing of Rin. He glanced toward the sleeping girl and the still guarding Jonin, who moved back into the shadows and let out a weary sigh. Suddenly he heard a soft chuckling from the shore of the training ground, and he felt the Jonin stiffened in the shadows and more shinobis appeared around the ground. A blonde girl stepped inside the training ground, slowly approaching the blonde. She wasn't more than maybe 4. Her green eyes curiously run over his sitting form. She walked until she stood only a meter from him. Toraku slowly tilted his head, examining his new companion, and he felt as the shinobi's muscles tensed and their heartbeats rose. He turned toward the hiding ninja behind him, who received his kunai and shook his head slowly in annoyance. I won't eat her, you know. The girl narrowed her eyes and Toraku shook his head once again, and a sigh left his lips, muffled by his mask. The tension of his guards didn't ease down, rather it increased. Who are you talking to? My babysitters. Green orbs looked onto his cerulean blue ones with a raised eyebrow. I saw your training. You are pathetic. Even I can make a bunshin. Toraku raised an eyebrow, then narrowed his eyes. I'm not pathetic. I'm actually quite strong. You are pathetic. How could you be strong if you can't even do something which I can? He snorted and folded his arms in front of his chest, eyeing the small child in front of him with a pout behind his mask. Your teammate also weak. What shinobi fall asleep in enemy territory? Shinobi who trust in their comrades. Toraku stated coldly and narrowed his eyes on the girl. I don't like you. The girl shrugged, but she sat down next to him, eyeing him curiously. You are ill? Toraku glanced down the girl next to him with confusion. No. Then you are ugly. Toraku snorted. I'm not ugly. I'm handsome. Then why are you wearing that mask? I'm in incognito. The girl narrowed her eyes, measuring him up from head to toe. I don't believe you. Only strong shinobi travel in incognito. So you are pathetic and ugly. A frustrated groan left Toraku's mouth. I'm not pathetic. I'm strong. Prove it. I'm not going to prove anything to a little girl. A victorious snort left the girl's mouth and she smirked. I know it. Toraku ruffled his hair in annoyance and let out a frustrated groan. Fine. Look. Toraku lifted his palm, concentrated chakra into it, and a shadow clone popped out from nowhere next to him, who let a satisfied smile run across his face when the girl yelped in her surprise, while the muscles of his guards tensed until the breaking point. The clone moved his hands toward his raised palm, where a small mini tornado already formed. The technique was small, but it already started to pick up sand under him, mixing it together with the wind chakra. The clone closed his eyes in his concentration, mixing another element into the swirling wind, and the increasing amount of sand mixed inside the whirling tornado. It started to glow with bright orange color, emitting heat when the fire chakra activated. Another clone popped up on the other side, channeling another chakra element into the mix. Water started to pour inside it, steam ran out from his palms, and the flowing tornado started to slow down, until it stopped and Toraku jerked his hand under it, before it could touch his skin. A small glass statue of a tornado lay at their feet, still glowing with a faint yellow light, with a small mounting at the base. The girl leaned forward slowly, but Toraku raised a hand. "Don't touch it now." The blonde moved his two palms toward the small statue, and razor-sharp wind chakra blades started to swirl around the small statue, cutting down the glass here and there at the mounting, and in the end soft wind started to flow out from his palms, cooling down the small statue slowly until he could touch it. The two clones watched it with satisfaction and finally popped out from existence with a small amount of smoke. Toraku grabbed the statue, and swept down the remaining sand from it and handed over to the amused child. "A small souvenir." The blonde child slowly turned it, examining the still tepid glass in the last beams of the settling sun, and yelped with excitement when a beam reached its surface, fashioning at the mountain to millions of colorful sparkles. Toraku let out a satisfied smile and a weary sigh and folded his arms once more. He was very satisfied with himself and the improvement in his chakra control. "How did you do that?" "That is a secret." The girl frowned, but he continued to look at the statue. "I don't understand. If you can do that, then why you failed before?" "I got a lot of chakra, and picking up this tiny amount is hard." The girl shook her head in confusion. Toraku tapped his chin and snapped his finger. He leaned forward and picked up a very small amount of sand with 2 fingers, then let it fall down to his palms. "Pick only 1 grain of sand from my palm." The girl gave a confused look, but after the second try, she successfully separated 1 grain in her small palm. Toraku nodded, and now he scooped his palms into the soft sand and held them out toward the frowning child. I can't even see the grains." Toraku nodded and watched how realization appeared on her chubby face. "Oh. See? That's why I can't do a bunshin properly." "But you do too before." Toraku slowly shook his head, ran through the seals, and a still unsteadily standing, but quite similar clone of him appeared next to him. He waved his hand toward the clone, watching and feeling as his palm ran through the compressed chakra in the air freely without any resistance. "It's just an illusion, as you can see." Another Toraku appeared behind the girl and ruffled her blonde hair and sat down next to her, poking her softly with a finger, and the clone started to speak. "Shadow clones are solid. Not like normal clones. This means we can hit, and fortunately we can't be hit more than only just once. That goes to the boss." The girl frowned and poked back the clone. Toraku rolled his eyes and nodded to the clone, who smirked under his mask and disappeared in a puff of smoke. "Teach me that." Toraku let out a small chuckle and shook his head. "No way. That is a dangerous technique, and you are just a brat. You would die if you even tried it." The small girl folded her arms in front of her small chest, sulking silently, and turned away from the chunin. "So, am I cool?" The girl made a wondering face and looked up. "At least she acts and looks like a normal child, not a premature kid like before. She is even cute." Toraku smiled under his mask, eyeing the small child in front of him softly. "Okay, maybe. But you could still be ugly under that mask." The teen narrowed his eyes and an angry snort left his mouth. "I withdraw my last statement. She is a harpy." He let out a weary sigh and waved a hand to the girl. "Come closer." She moved toward the boy obediently, and Toraku ran his fingers fast in the soft sand, creating a fine design with every stroke of his finger into the golden soil. The girl frowned until he finished it 5 minutes later. "Hey, Jonathan, don't be scared, we will be here." The Jonin frowned in the shadows, and Toraku channeled some chakra into his fast seal. His surroundings immediately become foggier and the voices around them muffled. The child shook her chubby head from side to side, and a small amount of fear ran across her face. "Relax. That is just a privacy seal. We are still on the training ground, but our picture is foggy from the outside." Toraku moved his hand, pushing his mask onto his blonde locks and sent a wide foxy grin toward the girl. Satisfied? The child examined his face for a long moment, and nodded. Toraku immediately put back his mask. So, this is our small secret. What do you say? The girl nodded and a warm smile ran across her face. Then I remove the barrier before my babysitter has a nervous breakdown outside. He nodded toward a foggy man, standing next to the barrier, and he channeled some chakra into it, dismissing the seal around them. He turned toward the angry Jonin and waved an apologetic hand toward the nervous ninja. You really aren't ugly. But you still look funny. Toraku had leaned back on the soft sand and let out a beaten sigh and waved a hand toward the child. I'm finished with you. I don't care anymore about my reputation. Think what you want. You are too troublesome. He slowly shook his head and glanced toward the slowly breathing Rin from the corner of his eyes. He sat up with a groan, and tilted his head from side to side. What's your name? Temari. The blonde girl gave him a small bow, and after a shrug also mimicked the gesture. So, Tamarican. I think it's time for me to gather my comrade and put her into a proper bed. And by the approaching footsteps, this is also the plan for you. The girl frowned and turned around to see her mother cross the corner. Toraku carefully eyed as a shoulder-length, sandy brown-haired woman approached them with a worried look on her soft features and a definitely round tummy. Oh ho! Toraku glanced down to his small companion and let out a small chuckle. You are in trouble, aren't you? The girl only nodded and waved a hand to the blonde before she ran toward the woman. Toraku let out a weary sigh and turned around to gather Rin and move back to their room. Fortunately, the night was uneventful and peaceful. The team needed the rest and none of them would argue with it. They were weary by the continuous walking, dry from the harsh wind, and their skin somewhere burned by the hot beams of the sun. Toraku put down privacy seals on his bed, so finally he was able to get rid of his mask at least while he slept, which was only minutes after he finally laid down on his bed. The blonde shifted in his hard bed and an unconscious moan left his mouth while he was sleeping. His head jerked to the side and he suddenly stopped breathing. Jiraiya frowned at the next bed, and after half-minute without a breath, he sat up in his bed, ready to shake the team back to reality. Before he could move to Toraku, the blonde jerked up, with wide eyes, painting heavily for seconds, then he crunched his head into his lap and stayed still, waiting to catch his breath. He stayed in that pose for a long minute while his breath settled down to a more pleasant level. He slowly leaned back on the bed, his palms rested on his eyes to ease away the remaining bits of his nightmare. The empty passages and that damn door, the sheer panic and that thing. With every night that thing became stronger and stronger. This time, he could even smell its scent, but he couldn't identify any familiar part of it. It was greasy, heavy, disgusting but still somehow also inviting. I'm not going to freak out, Jiraiya. Just a nightmare. About what? The blonde shook his and let out a weary sigh. Drowning. The Sannin raised an eyebrow but didn't answer, only waited patiently for him to continue. I don't know, it comes back sometimes. The first one at Kumo, when I was knocked out. After that it comes out. Sometimes. The blonde let out a weary sigh and rubbed his forehead, while the Sannin eyed the blonde curiously. Sometimes, bullshit, he was jerking in his dreams ever since we put our feet into the sand. Do you want to talk about it? Toraku let out an irritated grunt and turned his head toward the Sannin. I didn't know you were a psychologist or good with mind jutsus. Jiraiya only chuckled quietly not to disturb the other's dreams and leaned back into his pillow. Sorry, but I'm tired. Jiraiya didn't answer, only eyed the team curiously as he turned around, showing his back to him. He let out a weary sigh. He didn't need a subconscious analyst about that dream. I don't want to know what's behind that door. I don't want to open and face that thing. That is definitely not a human. Toraku glanced up, out of the window, up to the ink-black sky, spotted with faint yellow stars. He slowly closed his eyelids and forced his brain to settle down, to sink back into his well-determined dream. Hopefully very far away from narrow passageways, canals, ink-black oily water and from that thing at the other side of the door. The negotiation was dry, boring and they actually didn't talk about anything particular, just hovering around each other's option without even approximating any consensus. The Kazekage was tough nut to crack, even for Konoha's envoy when he finally spoke. The Kage concentration on the envoy only broke for moments when his eyes traveled to Toraku. That first time when their eyes met, the blonde visibly flinched by the cutting glance. After the first hour of speaking about nothing, Toraku felt his eyelids become heavier, and only a painful hunch from Jiraiya restrained him from falling asleep while he was still standing at the wall in the background. He was weary and his muscles were sore. He did slept last night, however it wasn't reposeful. In the third hour of standing still, without any movement, he felt himself more weary than yesterday night, and his mind slowly became heavier and foggier. His chakra flow slowed down and the voices in the office started to drift away and sounds muffled like he was submerged underwater. He had heard something in the back of his mind. Then he heard it one more time. A cracking voice. Someone cleared his throat. Something forcing him out from his mind, and his vision slowly became clearer and clearer, to meet the stern look and the narrowed dark eyes of the Kazekage. He blinked fast several times and turned his head around in confusion to realize that he was standing alone next to the wall, the remaining of his team waiting for him at the door looking at him. He scratched the back of his neck nervously and made a deep bow to the Kage, before fleeing out from the room with a hard snap on the back of his head by Jiraiya. "You are unbelievable. You were able to almost fall asleep in front of the Kazekage." Toraku only shrugged and let out a weary yawn before he made one last quick glance toward the door. He still felt the leader's eyes on his back and that forced a shiver down his spine. Toraku was sitting in the middle of yesterday's training ground alone, his mind was blank as he spaced out during his training. After he dismissed his last group of 3 perfect bunshin, he felt as the weariness finally reached him, but he didn't move from his spot. He was struggling to stand up and walk back to their crowded room, but it felt nice sitting on the soft sands in spite of having his company hiding around him. He closed his eyes and slowed down his breathing, trying to lock out his tiredness, when he felt a soft tug on his cloth. He let out a sigh, but he didn't open his eyes. "Hello, Temari." The blonde girl made a surprised look that Toraku couldn't see, but he could still sense the increased heartbeat, her tensed muscles on her chubby face and the sudden hic in her breathing. "How do you know it's me? I can smell you, hear you, and feel your chakra signature. Those are better identifications than even your eyes. Your vision could be tricked easily, but it's much harder to trick your other senses, you know." Toraku finally opened his eyes and turned toward the small child and smiled at her amused face. "For example, if you look around, you can't see anybody, can you?" The child slowly shook her head and her big green eyes sparked with curiosity. "Beside us, there are 3 more people in this training ground. A guy next to that pole stinks by the garlic he probably ate yesterday. There is a kunoichi hiding behind you underground, but her chakra flow jumped when you appeared, and the 3rd shinobi's heartbeat also increased on that tree when you arrived next to me." He slowly closed his eyes and let out a thin, almost invisible layer of chakra and nodded to himself. Temari looked around carefully where Toraku pointed, but she couldn't see anyone. "You want to learn something?" The face of the child almost sparkled, her eyes begged to the blonde and he couldn't help the warm smile that appeared on his face. "I take it as a yes." The blonde chuckled softly and tapped the ground next to him, signing to the child to sit down, which was immediately done. She glanced up at him with curious eyes, waiting for him to continue. "I take it you can channel chakra well if you already can do a bunshin." The small girl nodded in response, fixing her gaze on her companion. "Then, channel some chakra into your nose." Temari frowned, but did as he asked. Toraku watched the process with curious eyes. A little bit more, okay, good. Now, remember this level. If it's done you can release it. The small child nodded and turned toward Toraku with curious eyes. Now, close your eyes and sniff into the air a little. Can you smell something sweet? Temari frowned in her concentration and squeezed her eyes shut, forcing her nose to look for the scent. After 5 minutes she gave up and looked back at her temporary teacher. Nothing. Sorry. Toraku smiled beneath his mask. Now try it once more, but this time, channel the same amount of chakra into your nose. Try to push it into the flesh of your nose and not into the opening. Temari frowned, then nodded and did as he said, concentrating with every bit of nerve on the task for minutes, until her eyes popped open in her surprise. It's chocolate. A proud smile appeared on Toraku's face and he ruffled the blonde locks of the small child next to him. He dug his hands into his left pocket and placed a small amount of the named sweet into her tiny hands. Exactly. Your reward. A wide grin spread on her face and she immediately unwrapped the paper. They stayed in silence for several long minutes before her eyes traveled to the azure blue orbs between his mask and the small girl frowned. You look tired. I'm tired actually. How do you know? I could see the bags around your eyes through the holes in your mask. Toraku ruffled his hand through her hair, earning a displeased groan from his small company. You're really a smart girl. You will become an excellent shinobi. Temari smiled at him, almost grinning. You can't sleep? Toraku only nodded and glanced up to the flawless blue sky without a cloud. You are missing your home? The blonde chuckled. Home that I don't even know where I could call home. He closed his eyes and his mind traveled back to the green forests around Konoha, which warmed up his heart. Maybe I know after all. Temari gave a knowing look and she started to play with the sand in front of her, making small piles, digging holes. When I can't sleep, mother or father tells me a story. Toraku turned his head toward the girl, his eyes sparkling with curiosity. Do you want to hear a story from me? Maybe you will be able to sleep after that. It's a story my mother used to tell me when I got a nightmare. Toraku blinked at the unexpected kindness of the girl, then nodded without a word. There once was a great shinobi, someone who was feared and honored all over the lands. He was the nephew of the lightning god, you know. He traveled all over the world, teaching all kind of techniques to anyone who wanted. But he actually traveled to hunt down the monsters of the world and bring peace to the lands by defeating every demon. He fell asleep one day under an oak tree, and when he opened his eyes, he saw a fox looking for food in his bags. He watched the fox and in the end, he offered his last piece of dried meat. Years after that, when he faced with a demon near a village and he was about to die from his wounds, a fox appeared and sat down on his stomach to protect him from the demon. The fox couldn't help the shinobi, but he gave a final gift to the man and placed him onto the sky. If you look up at the night sky, you can see him in the stars watching over us and fighting with the monsters of the night, which don't let us sleep. This is how in the end he brings peace to the world in our dreams. Toraku stayed in silence for several minutes, eyeing the young child carefully. This isn't a bedtime story, I think, but it's still nice. Temari shook her head. No, but I like it. My mommy tells it much better. Father once showed me where he is. He called him Orion, I think. Toraku blinked and looked up to the blue sky, where he knew the constellation would appear in a few hours. Thank you, Temarican. I think I will be able to sleep tonight. The child smiled at him and felt as his inside melted away, but he didn't dare to even move a finger. The child chuckled and turned back to her almost ready sandcastle. Toraku smiled at the pleasant scene and he couldn't avert his gaze from the happy face. He suddenly froze as he felt a familiar presence, at a nearby house. He slowly turned his head to the side and looked up at a balcony to meet two dark and stern orbs. The eyes didn't avert from him when the man slowly approached them, floating in the sky on a golden cloud, to land gracefully on the sand in the center of the training ground. The Kazekage stood behind them, his arms folded in front of his chest, and his gaze sent a cold chill down his spine as the power of the man crested above his sitting form. The child didn't notice his presence as she continued creating another tower for her sandcastle. Toraku finally braced himself and straightened, attracting Temari's attention as he bowed to the leader. A soft yelp left Temari's small mouth and the dark eyes of the Kage traveled toward the child. Temari. We agreed on something last night. The voice of the Kazekage wasn't even similar to what Toraku already heard. It was hard, somehow still soft, and the child looked down to the sand in front of her in shame. I'm sorry, father. The child nervously closed her small fingers around the edges of her clothes. Go home. We aren't finished. The girl had bowed lightly and fled from the ground as fast as she could, but in the end, she still waved a hand toward Toraku. The blonde didn't even dare to blink, as the Kage moved his eyes back to his blue orbs, watching him suspiciously. I'm very interested why a shinobi of Konoha would teach anything to a child of Suna. Especially to the Kazekage's daughter. Toraku blinked in confusion and bowed once more, forcing his muscles to move despite the enormous killing intent flowing continuously from the Kage. He felt as two of the shinobi nearby started to shake by the feeling. The cold and threatening tone of the man sent chills again down his spine. I didn't know Temari was your child. I apologize, Kazekage-sama, if I caused trouble or my actions made you worry. I haven't got any malicious pretense toward your child nor to your village. He narrowed his eyes. He himself didn't know why he did that. Before his awkward silence could treat the Kage's tensed nerves, he felt a familiar chakra signature and relief flow across him. He never ever was so glad for the presence of the Sannin. The man slowly approached them, seeming to be aware of the situation. Kazekage-sama. He bowed to the Kage, who narrowed his eyes as a response. I demand explanations about your attendance in Sunagakure and his purpose. Immediately. The Sannin turned to Toraku and raised an eyebrow at the teen. What did you do? Toraku raised a hand behind his head and scratched his neck nervously. I just immediately removed the mask. I won't tolerate unknown and seemingly powerful shinobi around my children. The Sannin let out a sigh and shook his head in defeat. Kazekage-sama, allow me a short discussion with my Hokage. I didn't receive authority to reveal his identity. The Kage narrowed his eyes and nodded. The Sannin bit down his fingertip and ran through a chain of hand signs. Toraku immediately recognized the jutsu, and when a small yellow toad appeared in a puff of smoke he felt his mouth curved up in a soft smile behind his mask. The small toad looked around and stiffened when he felt the Kage's angry gaze on him, and immediately turned to Jiraiya. Tell Minato that the Kazekage demands to see under the fox's mask. It's urgent, no wandering around, okay? The toad rolled his eyes and disappeared in a puff of smoke without a word. The Kage stayed still with folded arms, eyeing Toraku with narrowed eyes, until within a small puff of smoke the yellow toad appeared on the shoulder of Jiraiya again in 5 minutes. Hokage-sama agreed until it is necessary, but only within 6 eyes. Jiraiya nodded in response and the small toad immediately disappeared with a small puff. Kazekage-sama, if you agree, would we please be able to continue this in a more private place? The leader nodded and turned around to head back inside his office. When they reached the building, the Kage snapped a finger and Toraku felt as every guard disappeared from the room, however not very pleased to let their leader alone with 2 enemy shinobi. Especially not with one of the Sannin. Jiraiya showed a privacy seal to the Kage, who nodded his agreement, and the blonde felt the same way like yesterday on the training ground. Lower your mask, Toraku. Jiraiya stated calmly, and the teen obediently took down his mask after a moment of hesitation. The Kazekage eyed him from head to toe, without showing any emotions, only his right eye twitched almost invisibly at the sight of the young man. "Who are you?" The blonde blinked and bowed. "Todoroki Toraku, Kazekage. What is your purpose here?" Toraku gave back a confused look and turned toward Jiraiya. "To escort Konoha's envoy." The Kage narrowed his eyes and moved his orbs toward Jiraiya. Understanding flashed through his dark eye when he connected the dots in the small puzzle, but his face stayed calm. "I see. Then we should still clear one more question. Why are you wandering around my daughter?" Toraku blinked and answered hesitantly. "Actually, it wasn't me who was wandering around her. She was the one who found me twice and didn't leave." "Why did you teach my daughter?" Toraku only shrugged. "Because she asked." The Kage narrowed his eyes, and confusion ran across his mind, however it wasn't visible on his face. He widened his senses at the very moment they stepped inside the office, to sense every twitch in his chakra flow, every tense in his muscles, even the changes in his smell, but the boy stayed calm and honest. "What the hell?" The leader narrowed his eyes, his cold glazed almost stabbing through the azure-blue orbs of Toraku. The three men stayed in complete silence for a long minute, waiting for each other's reaction. The Kazekage finally turned around and he slowly stepped to the large window. "You can put back the mask. Leave. I want to ask Jiraiya to stay for a little longer. And from now on, avoid my daughter." His voice was calm and tempered. Toraku put back his mask and he left the room after a bow without a word. The Kage let his eyes dwell on the village below his feet, and finally turned around to face the Sannin, who stood motionless in the middle of the room. "Your Hokage is a fool. Do you think I will tolerate that he sent a shinobi here, who need the surveillance of you? You brought possible danger to my village without my knowledge. To start a peace talk." Jiraiya's face stayed completely calm, and his tone made the same impression. "My apologies Kazekage, but I don't think Konoha's home affairs are considering you in any aspects. He put his foot inside the land of wind, inside my village. At this moment, he isn't a home affair. He is a threat to my people." Jiraiya narrowed his eyes and stepped next to the Kazekage and glanced out of the window, to catch as Toraku turned at a corner, heading back to their room. "I know you made strict security preparations because of our arrival. Especially for me, and Torakuken. Tell me, what had your shinobi seen when they watched the boy? What were their reports about? Because I don't think they were about a possible threat." The dark eyes of the Kazekage visibly twitched. "He is someone like you and I were once, before we lost ourselves in the shinobi world. He still carries and gives goodwill to anybody without considering who he gave it to. Goodwill isn't a value of a shinobi." "No. That is true. It is a value of a person." Jiraiya slowly turned around to face with the Kazekage, whose expression stayed the same, only his eyes mirrored some foggy emotions. Jiraiya bowed and left the room without a word, leaving the Kage alone with his thoughts. A young blonde girl was sitting on the windowsill, looking up to the darkening sky. She had already spotted the Vesper, and waiting patiently for more stars to appear. She wasn't aware of a man, leaned onto the doorframe of her room, watching her carefully without a word for a half an hour now. "Temari." The girl flinched at the sudden voice and looked back at her father. "Yes, father?" The small child glanced up toward the darkening sky, desperately looking for something, and she felt as her father moved closer to her small form, and also sat down on the stool next to her. "What are you doing in the widow?" "I'm waiting for the stars." The Kazekage frowned and glanced up to the sky. "You can't sleep?" The girl shook her head slowly. "I wanted to stay awake until he could sleep." "Who?" "Kitsunezan." The leader narrowed his eyes and leaned closer to his child, watching her carefully. He spotted a small statue in her small arms. "Don't go near him." The girl turned toward her father with confused eyes. Why not? Because he is an enemy ninja from another village. The child frowned in her confusion. I don't think he is a bad man. He looks funny, but he isn't mean. The Kage frowned. You saw his face? The girl nodded, slowly, not sure whether she should have told this to her father. He told me that I can't talk about what he looks like, because he is in incognito. The man frowned in his bewilderment. Why on earth would an enemy ninja show his face to a child? You asked him to show it? Temari gave a wondering look, tapping her small chin, then shook her head. No, I just told him that I think he is ugly under his mask and that's why he wore it. The Kage rested his dark eyes on his daughter's chubby face, wondering what this could all mean. Temari, why do you want to wait for the stars? Because he didn't tell me why, but I know he can't sleep well. So I told him the tale you used to tell me when I couldn't sleep, about the Orion. Why did you tell him that? Because he helped me, and I thought it might help him. The Kazekage's expression softened as he eyed his daughter. You really want to wait because of that? It will be more than an hour until they appear. The girl only nodded, and turned toward his father with determined eyes. A soft smile ran across his face as their eyes meet. Strange. Temari wasn't that kind of girl who cares too much for others. Actually, she didn't even like her brother. They were always fighting, arguing, but somehow in the last 2 days it suddenly stopped. The Kage opened his arms and moved her daughter into his lap. I'll stay until you go to bed, okay? Temari smiled back at him and nodded, then she tumbled herself into the soft fabric of her father's clothes, averting her green orbs to the darkening sky, looking for the Orion together with the leader of Sunagakure. A blond man was lying in his bed, glancing outside the window of their small, crowded room. It was an hour since the first star appeared in the ink-black sky, but he was still waiting for a group of stars to finally appear in the left corner of the window. He was waiting for the Orion, in the hope to finally sink into a dream without the endless sewer. When the stars finally appeared on the sky, a soft smile spread across his face and he let out a weary breath, and sank into a dreamless night. The Kazekage rested his eyes on Toraku for several moments when they entered the small office, but he didn't show any emotion. Neither on his face nor in his eyes. In the end, the preparation for the final peace talk with the Hokage himself was successful. However, the Kazekage made boldly claims in case of a future alliance, unlike Konoha's more moderate requests. The team carefully watched the Sannin from the corner of his eyes. They didn't talk after he left the Kazekage's office yesterday, however he was prepared for a rocket. Maybe he was bequeathing it to Minato. He unconsciously gulped when he remembered the threatening cold blue eyes of Minato the day before they left for Suna, and it forced a shiver down his spine. When the envoy finally finished and bowed toward the Kazekage, a loose sigh left Toraku's mouth. It's over. They would head home in minutes. He closed his eyes and a small homesickness ran through his veins when he thought back to Konoha. Their team also bowed to the leader, while Jiraiya thanked their accommodation and hospitality before they left the room, followed by the dark eyes of the Kazekage. The small team left Sunagakure right after the last glance from the Kage of the Sand Village. The travel from Suna was so uneventful that it was a pain in the ass. Toraku let out a relieved sigh when he finally spotted the great walls of the village with the 2 enormous wooden wings. He cheerfully hopped inside the village, and sniffed into the air to finally feel the familiar, sweet scent of Konoha, the mixture of wet soil and the freshly cut grass. Jiraiya tapped his shoulder and sent a smile to the blonde and nodded with his head toward the Hokage tower. The soft smile under his mask immediately melted away. He gulped, anticipating his execution by the blonde village leader. However, he still didn't quite understand what he did that was so damn wrong back in Suna. He could only think of the daughter of the Kazekage, and that only happened because he didn't know who she was. He let out a moan, but finally he nodded to the Sannin. They slowly approached the tower and Toraku hesitated at the door of the office before he stepped inside to face his destiny. Minato held his head in one of his palms as he frowned at a large scroll rolled over the desk. He blinked and finally turned his head toward the small group, a soft smile on his face. It took you long to finally arrive. I expected you earlier. Jiraiya only shrugged and handed over his report about the mission, which he'd already carefully prepared last night. The envoy also handed over his own scroll, bowed to the Hokage and then left the room without a word or even a nod toward the 4 shinobi who he'd lived with more than 2 weeks. Minato rolled his eyes at the scene, and waved toward Toraku. You can get rid of the mask from now on. Toraku blinked in confusion. He had forgotten that he was even wearing it, he was so used to doing everything with that thing on his face. He hissed in his annoyance and a muffled curse left his mouth, but he happily lowered it from his face. That is much better. Thanks. Minato smiled gently and held his hand toward Toraku, who placed it into his brother's opened palm. It's a shame. I had plans with that. Kakashi. I got some news for you. Minato made a cocky smile which forced the Jonin's only visible eyes to twitch, and in the end he raised a curious eyebrow. The beast is back and already looking for you. A defeated groan left the Jonin's mouth and palmed his forehead in irritation. When he will leave? Next week, so you will have some time together. The Jonin let out a weary sigh and nodded. Toraku's eyes were fixed on the Kakashi, wide with curiosity. Team meeting at my apartment at 6. What do you think about that? The Hokage asked cheerfully, and received nods and willing sounds from every member of the team. Before they turned around to left the room, Minato hollered out, Toraku, Jiraiya, a moment please. A soft moan left the blonde's mouth, but he turned around and closed the door behind the Sannin. I really didn't do anything. I swear. Minato gave a confused look to the blonde and to Jiraiya, who only shrugged, but nodded. He really didn't do anything. Minato sent an apologetic look toward the blonde and smiled. Actually, I wanted to thank you. You made quite a big impression on the Kazekage and that was also my intention besides some additional reasons. Toraku gave a confused look, and a raised eyebrow, then in the end he folded his arms in front of his chest, waiting for some explanation. Because of Kitsune's pressure, he wasn't playing poker during the preparations. The 4th Kazekage is a hard nut to crack if we are talking about diplomacy. He has got quite a unique view of the ninja world. And I also counted that in the end when you had to remove your mask. You used me as a distraction? Minato made another apologetic smile and shrugged, while the teen's eyes narrowed to a dangerous level. Sorry, but if I told you about my plan you wouldn't play your role. You are an awful actor, Toraku. The named teen turned to Jiraiya emitting a proper amount of killing intent toward the Sannin. You knew about this the whole time, don't you? And you left me in the thought that I ruined something after I had to remove my mask. For a full week while we traveled home. Jiraiya smirked and shrugged cheekily. If you may pardon me. I think I have to leave now, or I will try out one of my jutsus on the pervert in your new office, Minato. The blonde chuckled and waved a hand and the blonde left the room across the window without a word, with a twitching eye, but a still forced stoic face. However, Minato was sure, if he found a report tomorrow about a wiped-out training ground he would know who to blame. Minato let out a sigh and turned toward his sensei. So? Anything interesting news not included in your report? I had contact with every last of my spies, instructing them to watch out for someone with a Sharingan, but until now nothing. Jiraiya frowned and moved his thoughts toward Toraku. He definitely had been in Suna before, even in the Kazekage's tower. At some part he led the way, then he suddenly stopped and became confused, however the Kage didn't recognize him. Actually, he almost killed him when he found out his daughter was befriending him. Maybe he was somehow connected with the third one. Jiraiya shrugged and continued. Since the night we stepped inside the desert, he got nightmares. Drowning. At least he had said it was about that, and he seemed quite honest and disturbed enough when we spoke about it. But they suddenly stopped the night when he removed the mask, however I don't think it was connected with that event. So we still can't completely rule out Suna. Minato sighed and massaged his forehead. Jiraiya moved closer and sat down on the chair. I also travel a lot. I had already visited every big shinobi village and I didn't leave all of them with pleasant memories. We could assume that Suna was an important place for him. I told him Nagato's name. He reacted, however he said he wasn't sure what he felt, but he told me that it was respect. Everything still points much more toward aim than Suna. The Sannin shrugged, then he narrowed his eyes and fixed his gaze on the desk. I think you can relax. He won't do anything to harm you or the village. He will be okay under the continuous checkups with a Yamanaka. Jiraiya frowned and didn't continue his report for a minute, while Minato narrowed his eyes, carefully observing his sensei's uneasy expression. He asked me a favor. Minato raised an eyebrow and watched his sensei curiously, waiting for him to finally reveal something while he was definitely fighting with himself in his brain. He asked me to kill him if something goes wrong. Minato's eyes widened with shock. He froze for a long minute while thoughts ran through his brain. Jiraiya slowly shook his head, to ease away the disturbing thoughts. You gained a really honorable relative, Minato. The Hokage let out a sigh and dug his face into his palms, but a small smile still forced itself out. I know. Kushina made a feast for the gods and Toraku thankfully inhaled every last bit of the food after living mostly on ration bars for 2 weeks. The kunoichi watched him in awe as a third bowl of rice disappeared in his almost endless stomach. Who is this beast? Toraku asked curiously, leaning toward Kakashi, who just let out a sigh while Minato laughed until it finally died down to chuckles. The green beast of Konoha, the eternal rival of Kakashiken. The Jonin snorted and folded his arms around his chest. You will know him in time, I'm sure. He is a very unique shinobi. Minato stated with a wondering face, looking up to the ceiling, tapping his chin until a cocky smile spread across his fine features, earning a confused look from the blonde. Toraku glanced toward the annoyed Kakashi, but in the end only shrugged and continued inhaling his food. The team meeting didn't last long. They chatted about Suna, the desert, the town, and in the end the obviously low economics of the village. Then Toraku proudly stated that he mastered the bunshin, earning a confused look from Minato and Kushina. You know, I asked Rin to help me with my chakra control, before that I wasn't able to make a proper one. I don't think I could have done it without her. The young girl blushed, but she looked back to her first student with obvious pride. Minato shared a look with Jiraiya and turned to Toraku. I want you to play with open cards from now. Show us the techniques you mentioned before you left to Suna. A cheeky smile ran across Toraku's face. Okay, but find a place which disappearance won't bother you. Minato raised an eyebrow, but nodded and noted the skeptical faces on the others. Only Kakashi held his always stoic expression. Then tomorrow after the team meeting. The young teen nodded, but his cocky smile never left his face. The team left the small apartment and Toraku volunteered to see Rin home and Kakashi also tagged along. They slowly walked toward the narrow streets of Konoha, passing several civilians and shinobi. Toraku glanced up to the sky and crossed his arms behind his neck as they approached Rin's apartment. An irritated groan left Kakashi's mouth and Toraku tracked his eyesight toward a round mess of black hair and huge eyebrows and green spandex. A snort left his mouth as he realized he was facing the green beast of Konoha. The shinobi jumped in front of them gracefully and the blonde had to admit that, despite his appearance, his every movement exuded confidence and power. A wide grin appeared on his face, and he burst out to Kakashi. Hello everyone. I haven't seen you for weeks, Kakashi. I had almost lost my youthful thoughts without my eternal rival. Kakashi folded his arms and tilted his head to the side. I was out of town for a mission. The beast nodded and turned toward Toraku. And who is this youthful shinobi? Isn't he your new teammate everybody is talking about? Toraku raised an eyebrow and glanced toward the chuckling Rin, who waved a hand to him, while Kakashi nodded. Yash! I am Mato Guy, the beautiful and youthful green beast of Konoha. The boy grabbed Toraku's hand and started to shake enthusiastically, and Toraku felt as his mouth fell open in his shock. Todoroki Toraku. Nice to meet you. He finally graced himself and closed his mouth, glancing toward Kakashi from the corner of his eyes in disbelief. Kakashi and this guy, together? My rival, when will we encounter our youthfulness again? Kakashi massaged his forehead and shook his head. Guy, we've just got back from a mission. I will look for you, okay? The green beast grinned toward the Jonin and nodded, then disappeared after he waved goodbye to the others with a sunshin. Kakashi let out a relieved sigh and turned to the chuckling Toraku. Well, Minato was right. He is really a unique shinobi. Toraku couldn't help it and he burst out laughing and tapped the shoulder of the Jonin while they continued their trip toward Rin's apartment. The Yondaime Hokage of Konoha no Sato felt as his knees started trembling and he forced his muscles to move as he sat down onto the soft grass next to Kushina, whose lips parted, almost reaching the ground under her. The blue orbs mirrored shock and disbelief. Jiraiya watched the scene in front of his eyes, leaning against a giant rock, blinking rapidly, next to his other two new students in complete awe. And this is what is called Yuzu no Naraku, whirlwind of hell. Two clones popped into existence, holding out their hands, and a great tornado appeared from Toraku's palms, mixing with fire chakra and glowing a blindingly bright orange color. As the wind chakra reacted with the fire, its heat increased to an unbearable level. Toraku released the technique into the air without hitting anything, being sure to avoid a possible forest fire. He forced his breath to settle down and wiped the sweat on his forehead with the back of his hand. He showed everything that was in his mind from his arsenal. He made a satisfied grin when he looked over the faces on the side of the clearing and his heart twitched when he met the awe and pride in Minato's blue orbs. I worked on a smaller form of this during our trip to Suna, but I didn't try it out since I trained with my bunshins, so there is a chance it won't work. Toraku extended his left palm, and a clone hovered his own palms above over top, just like 3 weeks before on their trip. The small tornado immediately appeared and started to become thinner until it reached a thickness of a razor blade, while the clone started to channel his fire chakra into it slowly. This time, it didn't wobble when it finally started to glow in bright orange, and Toraku nodded to himself in satisfaction. I don't think I could throw it. At least not now, he muttered and frowned. But I could still use it as a blade, or something like that until I figure out how I can do that. You made this in 2 weeks? You have developed a new technique? Minato blinked in disbelief and Toraku released it and scratched one of his whiskers, thinking. Well, not exactly. I tried it only 5 or 6 times. However, I didn't try it out with other elements. Maybe it could also work with water and lighting. A wondering expression appeared on his features and nodded to the clone who just shrugged and repeated the movement before. Toraku concentrated water chakra into his palms and forced it into a thin line while it circulated in his hands. The clone started to channel the lighting element into it slowly, when the form suddenly started to wobble and a muffled "shit" left the teen's mouth. When the technique collapsed in his palms, it sent lightning chakra through his body and the clone puffed out from existence with a yelp. It knocked him hard to the ground, forcing out the wind from his lungs as his muscles in his chest squeezed painfully, his limbs jerking unstoppably, and his eyelids and teeth squeezed together from the force. When the element finally left his body, his persisting jerking died down to almost continuous small twitching. He forced his eyes open and rolled his body onto his stomach. He distantly noted that the others were next to him, and someone was already touching his back, probably Rin, but their voices were muffled and he couldn't use his eyes. When he tried to focus, only perpetually dancing white spots appeared in front of the foggy picture of the green grass he was lying in. He slowly moved his arms below his chest to push himself up, but his joints gave up, and he landed hard against the soil when his joints folded after another twitch. A harsh moan left his mouth as he was finally able to focus his vision to a blade of grass centimeters from his eyes. He finally wobbled himself to his hands and knees and shook his head to clear his foggy vision and brain. However, that was a bad idea. He immediately leaned forward and clapped his hands onto his mouth, forcing back the feeling to let out his breakfast in front of everyone. He breathed hard through his nose, his eyes closed into a thin line, and he tried to focus his brain on something else. Anything other than the feeling in his stomach. Finally it left him and he was finally able to push himself up to sit properly, leaning on his hands, his legs stretched out. I still hate lightning releases. He cursed under his breath with a muffled and harsh voice, blinked, and the picture of a worried Rin suddenly appeared in front of him, together with some dancing white spot. He shook his head again and blinked, forcing the annoying white spots to finally die down. I'm okay now. He forced a smile on his face to meet one of Rin's raised eyebrow and the disbelief on her soft face. A bright crimson tuft of silky hair dropped onto his shoulders and he realized that it was from Kushina, who lightly leaned above his head, grinning like a maniac, and patted the crown of his head before she moved back to give him more space. He felt a gentle touch on his shoulder, and when he turned to the other side, he found the couching Minato next to him, observing him with concern. I'm really okay. Jiraiya also stepped closer, his laugh filled the scarred lands around them while he ruffled the golden locks of Toraku. You know, sometimes I think you two are twins. Minato looked exactly the same when he had showed me the first version of his Hiraishin. He even threw up. It was a nasty scene. The named Hokage mumbled something incoherent under his breath in response while rolling his eyes in irritation, but his reddening cheeks were evidence of his embarrassment. Minato straightened himself and looked around on the devastated training ground. A great crack ran through the middle where one of the S-class wind releases met with the soil. He moved his eyes toward a giant black crater, which was made by a katan, Goryuka no Jutsu, Great Dragon Fire technique. Then he rested his eyes on the several cracks, cuts, craters and charred part of the training ground. The destruction was overwhelming, however Toraku carefully reduced the efficientness of the techniques. He leaned down to the teen and lifted him by his arm, gaining a thankful look from his brother. I think that was enough for today. The blonde only nodded as he leaned on his still unsteady legs. I'm finished. I showed you everything that I've got and I'm out of chakra. Minato nodded and a soft, warm smile ran across on his face. Out of chakra, He's still got more left than an average genin. I'm proud of you. Toraku blinked and he couldn't hide the smile on his face or his slightly red cheeks. Thanks. Minato ruffled the blonde locks and let the still smiling blonde put an arm around his shoulder, to help support his weight on his wobbling legs, while they walked back to the village for his well-deserved rest. The days and weeks went by with insane speed since they had returned from Suna. The peace talks with the other nations were going better than anyone would have expected. The fights and battles settled down at the borders, and the incidents between the nations had been limited to politics and battles of words inside offices and meeting rooms. Toraku let out a weary sigh when he thought back to why he was even sitting here for hours. Despite the national conflicts outside calming down, his inner struggle only becoming stronger and stronger. He was drowning again in his dream, however the door still held out, despite the increasing number of cracks and salients on its rusty surface. That dream avoided him for a while after they returned from Suna, but in the last week it appeared again with a force never before. Toraku glanced over the sleeping village under his feet from the top of Minato's newly carved head on the Hokage monument. It was almost 3 months since he had actually gotten into the everyday life of Konoha, a little bit more than 2 months since he became a shinobi of the village. They had taken several missions, mostly similar to his first, transferring reports and supplies to the borders and to other guard posts all over Fire Country. But some missions which were not connected to the war were starting to appear, and sometimes he helped in tracking with other teams, however they were rare occasions. A satisfied smile ran across his face as the first beams of the sun reached the top of his head, and slowly, almost invisibly moved down on his sitting frame, warming up his body. The village gently starting to wake up, he already could smell the sweet scent of the fresh bakery products. An ANBU squad leaped from rooftop to rooftop, in the direction of the village gates, probably already leaving for a mission. "They're leaving pretty early, Kat-chan." A silhouette of a kunoichi stepped out from the shadows of one of the yondaime spikes and sat down next to the smiling young chunin. He already knew most of the ANBU who were still assigned to watch over him, and he gave up the continuous pranking on them. Well, mostly. The devil never sleeps, and there was no way he would miss a perfect opportunity just screaming for his awesomeness. He still wasn't completely used to the feeling of continually being followed, but he came to terms with it, and also with the weekly checkups with Inoichi. They also started to meet on the weekends, forming something that could not yet be called friendship. He knew that it was for everyone's safety, and he couldn't deny that sometimes he was thankful to Sarutobi, regardless of his annoyance, that he didn't let down the surveillance despite Minato's request. In the end, Minato didn't go against his sensei's last will as the third Hokage, however he would be able to. He was the new Hokage after all. But Toraku knew that his brother respected the old man enough not to do that, and he didn't complain anymore. "How long will you stay here, Toraku-kun?" The teen only shrugged, not looking back to his masked companion. "Dunno. I like to wait until the streets start to become crowded." He let out a satisfied moan as he stretched his arms behind his back and leaned on them. "I saw you yesterday in the jewelry." The ANBU flung her head to the side and narrowed her purple eyes under the mask. "Relax. I only saw your back. But I recognized your scent. You shouldn't wear that robe, you got a nice butt." A furious snort left the girl as she immediately got up and moved back to the shadows, cursing and muttering under her mask. "That was a compliment, you know." He looked over his shoulder where the kunoichi stood in the shadows, then shrugged when he received no answer. Girls, nothing good enough for them. He let out a sigh and continued watching the rising village under his feet. The team lined up in front of a long desk, waiting for their next mission. Minato let out a weary yawn and scratched his burning eyes to ease away the unpleasant sensation, then he glanced toward another desk in the corner of the room, where an also obviously tired and weary-looking blonde clone frowned, leaning onto his hands above a big pile of paper. The clone blinked and made a grimace above a request and lifted up a signet to make a red marking of disapproval, muttering something angrily about unnecessary tawdry desires. Minato nodded toward the clone, who waved his hand in irritation as an answer and pull out another document from the pile to this time snort in his disapproval. Minato sent a thankful glance toward his brother, who suggested the idea yesterday night to use a clone to catch up with himself, when Minato almost collapsed on the futon when he finally arrived home. Peace talks go hand in hand with enormous amount of bureaucracy, and somehow Hiruzen had forgotten to mention that when he offered his seat. He would gladly delay his nomination by half a year if he'd known that in advance. Jiraiya cleared his throat, and this slapped Minato out from his wondering thoughts. He also cleared his throat and leaned toward a big pile of mission scrolls, handing over the correct one to his once-sensei. "This time you will go to the Kusa borders to relieve a sedentary force at one of our posts. It will be a week until the next relay, so prepare equipment for that period." Jiraiya raised an eyebrow, but in the end only nodded, and they left the room after a short bow and a waving hand from Toraku. His two teammates were tense as they started approaching their destination where they'd lost their teammate and friend. Toraku was unwontedly silent when he felt their mood, and he moved closer to the sage to chat with him during their trip. They befriended in the last month and he was slowly proving that he really liked Jiraiya. Well, except when he was annoying and showing off around girls. But despite that, he started to build up respect for the Toad Sennin, and he was thankful for the way the man acted around him since the first time they had met, not with immediate suspicion in his eyes like the others. He was more natural, especially since Suna. Maybe in some ways he trusted Jiraiya more than anyone else in the village, including his brother, despite their growing acquaintance since Minato's official nomination. Since the public ceremony, people started to recognize him, greet him, and he really enjoyed the sight of the smiling and beckoning villagers and shinobi. They didn't announce their relation, however everybody who wasn't blind or half-idiot could realize they were relatives by their appearance, how they interacted with each other, and the amount of time they were spending together. Gossip started to rise in the streets of Konoha and in the shinobi ranks about their relationship and his sudden appearance, and such talk increased with every rare instance he joined another group with Jiraiya or someone saw him training or sparring. Especially with Minato. A proud smile ran across his face as he thought back their last spar, even though it ended with an almost perfectly cleared training ground and unfortunately many more bruises on him than he would call acceptable. He could mostly keep up with Minato, until he used his annoying Hiration. Toraku had already spent long and sleepless nights trying to figure out how he could counter his irritating seal. He failed. But he was certain that the solution is near. Well, almost certain. Toraku thought back to the public ceremony when Sarutobi handed over his hat, and Minato first put it onto his own head. Minato's eyes almost glowed by the emotions, the joy, the pride, and the overwhelming determination which shined in his blue poles. He also felt the same pride when he was silently standing in the background together with Jiraiya, Kushina, Rin and Kakashi, but he was also aware of the disturbingly great amount of envy which ran across him for a second. An unconscious grimace appeared on his face, but it was replaced by a smile when he remembered the small, green and obviously old toad that appeared after the ceremony. He thought back to his fit of laughter when the old toad called the white-haired man beside him in his 40s Jiraiyakin and lectured him like a grandfather. After he congratulated Minato, he handed over a small pack, which held a short-sleeved long white coat with flame patterns on the edges with bright red kanji running down the center of its back, shouting and announcing who the man is from miles away by the words Yondaime Hokage. Toraku thought back to the endless teasing that Minato received from him and Kushina when he had started wearing that coat. He almost chuckled, but he restrained himself when in the distance of the never-ending grass field, he finally spotted the post. They reached the border quite fast just as last time. It didn't even take a day, however Toraku could feel the strain in his muscles this time. They slowed down before the guards became suspicious and now they were slowly walking toward the bunker. A shinobi jumped down from the flat roof, eyeing them suspiciously, then his eyes wandered toward Toraku and Jiraiya and he let out a weary and relieved sigh. "I'm glad you arrived, Jiraiya-sama." The shinobi bowed and smiled at the white-haired man. "You are careless. What if we were IWA forces under a henge?" The ninja slowly shook his head and chuckled. "The chances are minimal and I doubt that any of them would dare transform into you. Especially not to Toraku-san." The teen raised an eyebrow and carefully eyed him from head to toe, but he couldn't identify the man. He never met him before. In the end, he just shrugged to himself and counted that to Minato's fame. The man waved a hand to follow him and they stepped inside the sparse facility. Toraku unconsciously expanded his senses to map his surroundings. He felt 3 more shinobi around the post, one on the rooftop, one outside and one more inside. Jiraiya turned toward the shinobi. "Anything we should be aware of?" The shinobi shook his head in response. "Nothing happened during the last week. Everything seems peaceful. Only some patrolling IWA troops passed the post from a distance, but they didn't show any belligerence." Jiraiya nodded and handed over a scroll to the shinobi, who accepted and stowed it inside his pocket. "I'll escort you around. When you settle down we'll leave. I can't wait to finally sleep in my own bed." Jiraiya chuckled and placed a hand on the ninja's shoulder. The man quickly, but efficiently showed them around, and they finished on the roof where the remaining of his team already waited for them, packed and ready to leave. The shinobi pointed toward several parts of the landscape where they would find the sensing seals. He also asked Jiraiya to place more on other places of the ground. After a half-hour-long report, he finally nodded to himself in satisfaction, and they left to head back to Konoha. Jiraiya turned around to face the team, pointing toward Kakashi and Toraku. "You'll take the first round for the watch post. From now on, we will work with 12 hours rounds. Be alert, we may be nearing peace, but you never know." The boys nodded, and Jiraiya pointed toward Toraku. "Send out some clones and check those seals. Maybe you could upgrade them a little. They're barrier seals, after all." Toraku nodded and grinned as 50 clones appeared beside him, and dissolved in every distance of the compass. The Sannin only rolled his eyes, muttered about swanky teens, while he and Rin moved back to the establishment to rest before they would take over for the boys. Toraku had laid down in the middle of the roof and crossed his arms behind his neck and started to watch the night sky. An angry snort echoed on the roof, and Kakashi moved next to him with dangerously narrowed eye. "What do you think you're doing?" Toraku didn't move, only his eyes turned toward the Jounin. "Guarding the post." Kakashi kicked his leg, forcing Toraku to sit up and meet his angry eye. "This is not a game, you know." The blonde let out a sigh. "I sent out 50 clones, and they already started to apply more security seals on the borderline. I've got better senses than you, or Jiraiya, so just relax. Nothing is going to happen." The Jounin didn't answer, only moved to the edge of the roof and moved his eyes to the forest belt. Toraku let out a sigh and moved next to the Jounin. "Look, I know why you're like this. But calm down. We're well prepared." Kakashi only blinked and didn't avert his gaze, but after a long minute he hesitantly nodded. "I'm a little tense. I noticed that. I hate to be near the IWA borders." "I know. And Aniki also knows. I think that's why he sent us here." Kakashi didn't answer, only clenched his hands into fists. "I also figured that out, but this is a sour medicine Minato gave me. And Rin. Don't think it is easier to him, sending out his comrades and his friends to missions where they could be killed." Kakashi slowly shook his head. "I don't think that. And we also know that. We are shinobi." Toraku rolled his eyes and let out a sigh before he moved to the other side of the roof and sat down, this time to properly do his guarding role despite his 50 clones running around the post. The days were moving with the speed of a snail. Nothing had happened in the last 3 days. The most interesting event was when one of Kakashi's summons chased a fox away from the post. Toraku sat on the edge of the flat roof, his legs flung freely over the edge, while he was watching the forest belt. He closed his eyes and extended a thin layer of chakra in the clearing, watching any tweak in its flow, but nothing came. He let out a weary sigh and glanced over his shoulder toward Kakashi, who had sent out one of his freshly trained Ninken to patrol. Toraku really liked the dog, even though their first meeting hadn't ended tenderly. Sometimes he still felt the sharp fangs of the small pug around his ankle, and the small pooch still couldn't explain why he had done that. However, maybe it was just because he couldn't talk properly yet. Aside from the limited vocabulary that Kakashi had already taught to the mutt, he mostly just barked. Just then, said small Ninken reappeared in the high grass at the horizon, drawing a thin, straight line toward the tower in the vegetation. Pakken finished his patrol. Kakashi nodded and moved next to the blonde and leaned over the edge to eye his small comrade as he was approaching them. The dog hopped onto the vertical wall and easily ran up to them and sat down, panting heavily. He looked up Kakashi with his sparking, intelligent eyes frisking his tail lightly. He was still young, still in the beginning of his training. He hadn't yet developed the stamina for a long run or to take part in a real fight. He just wasn't that type, but the pup was almost as stubborn as Toraku and had an exceptional nose which could rival his own. Anything? Kakashi asked curiously, waiting for Pakken to catch his breath. But the small dog only shook his head. Kakashi nodded and dismissed the dog, who disappeared in a puff of smoke after a nod toward the blond boy. Toraku stretched his limbs and yawned before he settled down to his previous place on the edge of the roof again. Hey Kakashi. What have you been doing with Jiraiya lately? I mean with those scripts. The Jounen's only visible eye twitched and Toraku could swear that the edge of his ears turned flaming red in the dark night, however his face didn't give away any further reaction, nor did he answer the question. Only waved a hand to the blonde and turned his back on him and tensed his shoulders. The Chunin raised an eyebrow then shrugged, but the curiosity never left him. He would have to investigate that a little later. They stayed in silence for long minutes until Toraku rubbed his burning eyes and let out a weary sigh, yawning again for maybe the 100th times in the last hour. You should speak with Rin. The blonde glanced toward his companion with a confused face. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm perfectly fine. The Jounin turned back with narrowed eye after a doubtful snort left his nose. Yeah, sure. Except you haven't slept 6 hours in total since we arrived here. The blonde's eyes twitched in irritation. Don't spy on me. I'm not spying on you. I just sleep next to you. I'm neither blind nor deaf. I'm alright. No, you are not alright. You're exhausted and the only reason you haven't dropped from fatigue is the soldier pills you eat when you think nobody is watching. If you don't speak with Rin, I'm going to speak with her. And believe me, it would be better if you go to her and not vice versa. She will still yell your hair down from your head, but maybe she could help and give you something to stop those nightmares. Toraku visibly flinched, but in the end let out a long, weary breath and closed his eyes. His mind almost immediately started to become numb and he couldn't deny it anymore. He was truly exhausted to his very core. Okay. I'll speak with her when she's awake. His voice was faint, but Kakashi nodded in his satisfaction. Toraku suddenly stiffened, and a shiver ran across his spine. He looked around, and immediately expanded his chakra from the rooftop, earning a confused and worried expression from the Jounin whose muscles instantly tensed, ready to react if necessary. What? Kakashi whispered toward Toraku, who closed his eyes, frowning, then shook his head. Nothing. Nothing is out there. Kakashi frowned, when 5 clones appeared next to the blonde and jumped down from the roof and ran toward the forest line. Just a precaution. The Jounin moved next to Toraku and revealed his left eye under his hitayat. The tomos started to whirl slowly as he moved his sight over the landscape, looking for any hint of chakra inside the woods beside the seals. Finally he nodded and replaced his forehead protector, but he didn't relax his tensed muscles. The 2 teens stayed in full alert for hours, but only a lonely deer appeared from the forest and slowly moved to the middle of the clearing then left after half-hour as silently as it came. Toraku let out a weary sigh. He felt as his eyelids became heavier as exhaustion started to take over his body and his brain. He shook his head to ease away the weariness, with little success. A strange feeling never left him, despite the fact that he'd expanded his senses to the maximum where he wouldn't go insane from the normal sounds and sense of the nature around him. He let out a weary sigh as he moved to the edge of the flat roof. A blonde clone popped up next to Kakashi. I'm going out for patrol. He will report if I find something. The young Jounin nodded and moved closer to the edge to watch as his blonde comrade landed gracefully in a crouch and ran toward the edge of the woods after several blonde heads popped into existence around him, dissolving into different directions of the woods. A nervous frown appeared on his face, his muscles tensed unconsciously when the last golden crown disappeared from his sight. Toraku jumped down from a branch, landing in a crouch in a small clearing, and slowly moved closer to an ancient giant oak tree. He ran through a short chain of hand sings and gently placed his palm on the raw surface of the tree. A complex, ink-black spider web pattern appeared on the small clearing, made by kanji, symbols, curves, and straight lines. The blonde Shunin leaned closer to the center of the pattern, forced it to glow with a tiny amount of chakra and examined it carefully, looking for anything suspicious on the predominant seal which controlled all the other ones along the borderline in this district. Toraku let out a weary sigh and rubbed his burning eyes. I really need a long nap. A clone popped into existence. Tell Kakashi that I'm going to check the last 2 of the control seals. I will be back in half an hour at maximum. The clone nodded and disappeared with a loud puff, breaking the complete silence in the ink-black night. The memory of his previous command immediately appeared in his head. At that very moment he felt dizzy and had to lean on the large tree for support, then shook his head to ease away the feeling. I'm more exhausted than I thought. Something started to nag at the back of his mind, but he didn't have time to react as he heard a muffled thud, then immediately felt a small sting in his neck. His head started to spin with a force he never felt before. His knees gave up and he fell to the ground limply. His brain still worked, but he couldn't focus his thoughts, nor his chakra to warn the others. He dimly saw a movement from the corner of his eyes and distantly realized that his clones had disappeared, but his dizzy and continuously spinning brain couldn't process the memories. He struggled, forcing his brain and muscles to work, forcing his eyes to focus. A foot in ninja sandals shrouded his vision and his eyelids started to give up the fight with the gravity. A distant urge reached his raw mind, screaming desperately to move his body, but he couldn't even twitch a finger. He drifted to the blackness of unconsciousness, while the screams in his mind slowly died down. Kakashi glanced toward the clone, who stoically sat on the edge of the roof, his legs hanging in the air. The clone suddenly stiffened and turned toward the young jounin. Message from the boss: he is checking the last 2 control seals and he will be back in half an hour. The jounin nodded and turned his head toward the woods again. He saw a sudden faint glow from the corner of his eyes. His muscles moved unconsciously, snapping his head in the direction of the light, when he felt a faint stinging sensation in his neck. The last thing he could note with his numb mind was a muffled puff as the clone disappeared before he lost consciousness, not even a second after the sting in his neck. He couldn't even feel the pain of his head connecting with the rooftop with a muffled thud. They were moving. He felt it vaguely, but he couldn't open his eyes. He felt dizzy, still unable to focus his thoughts. The last bits of his rational mind were desperately struggling to reach for his chakra, but his aggressively spinning brain made all attempts in vain. A moan left his mouth as his body jerked and the one who was carrying him landed hard on a branch, forcing his lungs to discharge the air from his limp body. In the back of his mind he realized that they had stopped, at least he couldn't feel the wind in his blonde locks or on his skin anymore. He dimly felt as his eyelids started to twitch by the strain of trying to open them. He's gaining consciousness again. Give him another dose. He was harshly dropped to the ground. He already got a second one. A third could kill him. A satisfied snort reached his ears, but he could process the previous sentence for several long seconds. That would be a relief. He attempted to force his desperately screaming muscles to move, and he was finally able to open his eyelids halfway. The only thing his spinning brain recognized after long seconds of delay was 2 hexagonal patterns on a metal plate which occupied his vision as the ninja leaned closer to him. IWA. A dim sensation of stinging pain reached his foggy mind and his vision started to become darker again. He barely recognized a needle in the straightening shinobi's hand, before he drifted back into unconsciousness. Kakashi felt a hand on his shoulders and a warm sensation run through him by healing chakra, then someone shook him violently. He let out a groan, and forced his mind and body to work. After a long minute, he finally managed to open his eyelids halfway. His dizzy eye met 2 pair of worried ones above him. Finally. He shook his head and forced his aching muscles to sit up with the help of Jiraiya. What happened? The Jounin blinked and jerked his head to the side, sending another fuzzy feeling through his abused brain. Where is Toraku? Rin and Jiraiya shared a worried look, and the white-haired man finally shook his head. You were ambushed. I still don't know exactly how, but they took him. They must be about half an hour ahead. We are lucky I came to check on you. Kakashi wanted to jump to his feet, but he faltered and would have landed flat if Jiraiya hadn't caught his arm. He shook his head again, and this time he was able to stand straight, leaning on the sannin. He felt as his inside twisted with the urge to get rid of his last meal, but it fortunately died down after 2 deep breaths. We have to track them down, Kakashi stated with a cracking tone while Jiraiya examined the teen and nodded when he finally straightened, letting go of his hands as his foggy vision started to clear. Indeed. But we can't leave the post without guard. We'll have to split and our forces will decrease drastically. Those who took Toraku weren't greenhorned shinobis. They managed to sneak up on him. Kakashi nodded. He was exhausted. Otherwise that would just be impossible. But who? Jiraiya nodded. They were only after Toraku. Maybe they want to use him as political pressure. I could imagine this kind of thing from that old geezer Inoki. Jiraiya rubbed his temple, forcing his brain to work harder. Rin, you will stay here with one of my summons. But first we'll need your every skill. I need Kakashi to chase them since they didn't get far. The girl nodded and sent a worried look toward Kakashi, whose sight still seemed to be a little foggy. Kakashi. We don't have time. I'll need your tracking skills. The boy nodded and ran through a chain of seals, to summon Pakken. Why didn't we get rid of the others? Killing one of Konoha Sennin would be a great effort from IWA toward the other nations. Our mission was only to get that sissy. And don't think that getting rid of one of the Sennin would be a piece of cake. This time no killing, it doesn't matter how bad you or I want it. The Kazekage wants him alive. Yes, Commander. A defeated voice reached Toraku's mind. His brain was still foggy and dizzy, but at least he could sense his chakra this time. Shouldn't we give another shot to the sissy? He's already received enough to knock out an elephant. However, he's been too still in the last half hour, not like before. Toraku didn't move. He felt that his hands were tied tightly behind his back and his ankles together, and he could smell the metallic scent of his own blood as the razor-sharp wires cut into the soft flesh of his wrist. His captor threw down his body roughly to the hard soil again, but he forced himself to bear the pain as his head met with the hard ground with a muffled thud. He forced his body to relax and lie limply. He started to hear muffled voices around him more clearly 10 minutes ago, but this time, when he started to come out of the darkness, he focused with every nerve to stay still and limp on the shoulder of whoever was carrying him away from the post. Toraku felt a sharp object graze across his lying shape, but he forced his nerves to calm down and stay still, despite his raising panic. He heard muffled footsteps, and a soft breath on his arching neck as one of the IWA shinobi leaned closer to examine him closely. Not good, this is not good. He suddenly felt a foot stamp painfully into his stomach and he heard the guttural laughter of a man after it. That isn't part of our mission. The baritone barked toward Toraku in a commanding voice, probably addressed to the one who kicked him. Commander, he only gave him what he deserves. A higher voice could be heard, probably a kunoichi, while the commander snorted in displeasure. Give him another shot, just for precaution. We have to reach the borders as fast as possible. Toraku dreadfully forced his brain to focus, and when the man finally stepped away, probably to get the needle with the drug, he knew this will be his only chance to act before he was forced back into unconsciousness again. He desperately reached toward his pathetically shaking chakra and, with effort beyond what a normal human could exert, he forced it to flow through his coils. His eyes snapped open and a satisfied smirk appeared inside his still dim mind when he saw a foggy picture of a man flinching a step back in surprise as his mud-brown eyes locked with foggy azure-blue ones. 4 shadow clones popped into existence in front of him, barricading him from the shinobi with their bodies. The clones looked weary, their minds also dizzy and hazy, while their limbs were trembling violently with the effort to even stand straight. Impossible. He distantly heard as one of the IWA shinobi whispered in disbelief. One clone wobbled a step back and popped out of existence when he suddenly dropped to the ground. Toraku forced another wave of chakra out of his body and a clone appeared crouching next to him and immediately started to cut the wires around his joints with a sharpened wind chakra. The blonde hissed when the trembling blade cut deep into his ankle. Finally the last wire was cut, but before he could move the IWA neens shook off their surprise and jumped into action. The blonde Chunin pathetically, but still quickly rolled to the side to evade the exploding spikes from the ground under him, dispelling his clones immediately. He forced himself on all fours, panting heavily by the strain, feeling like an animal driven into a corner. His cerulean orbs flung from shinobi to shinobi, desperately trying to catch his breath after that small movement. The 4 IWA neens slowly approached him, ready to swing into action. One of them already had a needle in his hands, ready to push him back into unconsciousness. He slowly moved his hand onto his leg, to get a kunai from his pouch, but he realized that it was gone. His eye twitched in irritation, but his hands traveled back toward his still secured headband without a pause in the movement. He dimly saw as the 4 shinobi jumped toward him, most of them already forming several hand seals. His sight became foggy again, his mind started to spin and with his last resort, he finally found the small paper tag hidden behind the metal plate and slammed it to the ground after he channeled some chakra into it. Then he fell limply to the ground as his trembling joints gave up the fight with gravity. Toraku blinked rapidly, shook his head and slowly opened his eyes to glance toward the foggy silhouette of 4 frozen shinobi on the other side of a small, wobbling purple barrier. He forced himself onto his hands and knees, panting unstoppably and forcing his limbs to move into a sitting position. Toraku slowly closed his eyes while he distantly heard punches and kunai clinging on the outside of his wobbling barrier. A satisfied smile appeared on his face. The barrier wouldn't last long with this wretched chakra control, but at least he could gain some time to gather himself and think of a plan. He felt a vibration under him, as an attack reached the lower part of the barrier, buried in the soil. He shook his head to clear his mind, however with little success, and he finally fixed his gaze on the purple glow of the barrier. His vision became clearer, the silhouettes sharper, and the spinning of his brain died down to a more tolerable level. 4 IWA shinobi snarled at him, probably emitting a large amount of killing intent. Fortunately the barrier intercepted it, he doubted his body would be able to tolerate it. Toraku couldn't surpass the temptation and he sent a cocky grin toward one of them, earning a narrowed gaze from the largest member of the team from stone. Surround the barrier. Don't forget we need him alive. All IWA neen moved to the 4 corners of the barrier without hesitation as Toraku eyed them curiously. Not that he could do anything more in his pitiable state. He pushed himself up to stand on his wobbling legs, leaning onto his knees to help support his weight. His eyes moved toward the commander and he finally straightened himself, reeling a little from the effort, and forced more chakra into his fading shield. The shinobi's eyes shined victoriously as the purple barrier wobbled and a crack appeared on the side after a long 10-minute staring contest. Toraku slowly turned his head toward the crack and narrowed his eyes, while forcing his still trembling chakra to flow smoother. His limbs felt like they were made of lead and every little movement sent pain toward his weary brain. He moved his arms together and crossed his fingers, preparing to perform his signature jutsu, when his barrier collapsed. Normally, he wouldn't need to use any hand signs for that, but now he needed every bit of help with his wobbling chakra to perform any kind of jutsu. He was lucky the first time to be able to make those 5 pathetic clones, and they were even solid and useful. Another crack appeared above him and he tensed his aching muscles. The four Iwa Nines moved to stance, and also started to form hand sign, preparing to attack when the seal faded away. A small purple shard fell on his shoulder and when it touched him, the barrier collapsed into millions of pieces and disappeared when they reached the ground. The four shinobi took that as the signal and jumped toward him. Near. A barking voice echoed in a clearing. A silhouette of the white-haired Sannin ran through the clearing inside the forest, the trees spotted with giant mushrooms, with a small mutt in his hands. The man's form blurred by the insane speed while they were traveling. The heavy breathing of Kakashi could be heard only meters behind him as they rushed with insane speed deeper into the dark woods. I won't let it happen again. Kakashi muttered to himself between two harsh breaths and he forced more chakra into his legs. Two clones appeared next to him and grabbed his still crossed arms to throw him out of the way of the four Iwa Nines. He landed hard on his back, carving a long straight line into the ground where his body slid through the hard soil. A painful groan left his mouth and he could only roll to the side, before a chakra-boosted fist slammed where he was a blink ago. He rolled further and moved to a pathetic stance, almost falling back. The four shinobi appeared around him and jumped into action immediately. Toraku struggled between the punches for several long minutes, and he could taste his own blood inside his cracked mouth. His only real success was when he managed to destroy that damn needle. He fell to the ground from a well-placed hit on his temple and the world suddenly became soundless, except a sharp whistle, while dark spots danced in his vision. The teen struggled on all fours in the middle of a mud puddle created by an earth release, while the Iwa Nines tried to catch him. He desperately shook his head to ease away the whistle and gain back the focus in his eyes, but before it happened a familiar foot kicked painfully into his stomach again, forcing out every bit of air from his lungs. He fell back to the ground on his stomach with a disgusting splashing sound as his body hit the mud. He turned his head and tried to open his eyes, however he couldn't open the left one. He couldn't move. He never felt so weak, so vulnerable. So defeated. A harsh voice was continuously screaming inside his head, to get up, to fight, sometimes even teasing him, how sick and pathetic he was. Toraku hardened himself and slowly moved his hands under his chest to push himself up one more time. Give up and just stay still. Don't make this harder than necessary. He heard a harsh baritone voice whisper into his ear and he felt a rough hand on his shoulder. An animalistic snarl left his mouth at the unpleasant feeling. 2M stubborn. I'll never give up. A foxy grin appeared on his face unwittingly, while he heard his own cracking, but determined voice from a distance. He tensed his aching and heavy muscles to shove the man off of his back, before he could be knocked out, when he heard something in the distance. He blinked in surprise. Birds. Birds were chirping continuously. Not one, not a dozen. Hundreds, maybe thousands of chirping birds could be heard from everywhere. His left shoulder started to ache painfully, like someone had stabbed him with a knife and twisted it, but he only managed a painful groan. The spinning feeling reappeared in his brain while he distantly sensed that the dark night was starting to glow an azure blue while a familiar scent forced its way into his nose, suppressing the metallic scent of his own blood mixed with the wet soil and mud around him. He didn't sense anything else, only the chipping of 1,000 birds around him, and flashes of blue. For small furred paws appeared in front of his blurry eyes, distant yelps and explosions forced themselves into his raw ears. He turned his head slowly and looked into a pair of chocolate-brown worried eyes of the small pug. Pacan. The pup nodded and started to bark loudly next to the blonde, who forced his eyes shut by the irritating and loud voice. He heard as someone landed in the mud next to him and he was finally able to open both of his eyes and turned his head toward the white-haired man. Took you long enough. You stopped at a bath? A cocky grin spread across his face and the Sennin couldn't help but smile back softly. Stay there Gaki and don't move. Toraku snorted and let out a small chuckle. When Jiraiya disappeared, jumping into the middle of the fight around them. A minute later a clone of Kakashi jumped next to the blonde, who already started to struggle himself up. "Nice jutsu you got. Where did you learn?" The clone had chuckled awkwardly and helped him to sit up. The blonde shook his head and split out sidelong some blood, then leaned on Kakashi to straighten himself on his wobbling legs, coughing to clear his throat. "They gave me something that I don't think I can help. My chakra system is messed up totally." The clone nodded. "Can you stand alone? I'm not that pathetic, you know." He sent a foxy grin to the clone, who rolled his two visible eyes and nodded before he jumped after the Sannin into battle. Jiraiya held up one of his hands to stop Kakashi from rushing forward where the four Iwa Nins surrounded the obviously woozy Toraku. Jiraiya narrowed his eyes at the sight as Toraku was wobbling on his legs, desperately trying to defend himself. The four Iwa Shinobi were using only low-level jutsu to capture him, and taijutsu to knock him down. Toraku was obviously able to free himself. Jiraiya gestured to Kakashi to the right with his head and put the small mutt down on the ground. The Jounin nodded and without a word he positioned himself next to the group. He immediately uncovered his Sharingan and glanced to the Sannin, waiting desperately for the sign to jump into action. The Sannin slowly ran through a chain of hand sings and nodded to the Jounin. Lightning chakra encompassed his fist and quickly surrounded his arm almost to his shoulders. The familiar voice of 1,000 chirping birds echoed in the clearing, forcing the Iwa Shinobi to freeze when Kakashi burst out from his hiding place with insane speed. His attack cut deep scars into the ground where the lighting chakra plunged into the soil as he dashed toward the large shinobi leaning above Toraku's laying form, ready to knock him out with the back of his kunai. He shot his hand toward the Iwa commander and felt as his hand plunged through the man's body, straight into his heart, before his body melted away into a pile of mud. Kakashi dismissed the mud clone, turned, and leaped toward a kunoichi who had already started forming hand seals without a pause in his motion. He jumped and slid across the mud to strike her from behind, but his hands didn't reach her. A stone wall appeared between them, but Kakashi didn't bother himself to stop. He used the wall, and leaped toward the caster from it. Jiraiya stayed in his hiding spot, watching the enemy's reactions carefully, as Kakashi rushed toward the commander of the team. A half-smile ran across his face, and he jumped into the battle forming one single hand seal, rushing toward an empty spot. Ranjashigami no Jutsu, Wild Lion's main technique. His hair suddenly expanded, hardened and exploded into the ground, forming a wild, lion-like snarl. The Sannin narrowed his eyes, and with another seal his hair dragged out a giant shinobi from the soil. The lion-like fangs had bitten hard into the shinobi's shoulder, drawing small crimson lines of blood on his brown flak jacket. He released the jutsu and his hair moved back to its original form. Jiraiya made another hand seal and a shadow clone jump toward Kakashi to provide backup with the other three Iwa Jounin. Jiraiya already recognized the man in front of him, and he would be a hard nut to crack. He hoped Kakashi could handle the others since he had to face the second commander of Iwa's shinobi forces, Kitsuchi. The man narrowed his eyes and glanced toward his comrades from the corner of his eye. The Sannin utilized the opportunity and immediately jumped toward the man, landing a hard punch to his temple to knock him out in one shot. A painful grimace ran through the sage's face as his fist connected with solid rock instead of hard bone. The commander's right fist became encased with rock and he swung his punch toward Jiraiya in response. Meanwhile, Jiraiya ran through hand seals and his hair immediately expanded, surrounding the Sannin's form with sharp spikes of the Hari Jizo, needle Jizo. A countless number of sharp needles shot toward the commander, who jumped backward and ran through numerous hand signs in midair, slamming his palms onto the ground when he landed. Doton, Doriahiki, Earth Release Wall. A mud wall appeared in front of the commander and immediately hardened, deflecting the sharp needles. Jiraiya didn't waste any time, he jumped above the wall to release a fire technique toward the commander. Kakashi distantly sensed the clone of Jiraiya as it hopped down next to Toraku to check up on his condition, while he was occupied with the other three ninja. He heard the cracking voice of the blonde, then he felt the same clone jump next to him. How is he? Disoriented, probably drugged, beaten and cocky. He'll be okay. Kakashi nodded and crossed his fingers to create a shadow clone for himself. He nodded toward the blonde and the clone jumped to Toraku. It's time to get serious. Kakashi nodded his approval and shot out toward the kunoichi in front of him, drawing out his short katana while Jiraiya's clone jumped toward the remaining two Iwa nin. Jiraiya was finally able to single the commander with a fire release, who was continuously hidden underground during their fight. He glanced toward where his clone and Kakashi were fighting with the remaining Iwa jounin. The Sannin bit down his fingertip, summoning a man-sized stoic-looking green toad with a katana on his back. Gamma Hero, I need some backup here. The toad blinked, looked around and immediately jumped into stance at the sight of the charging Iwa commander. Jiraiya flinched when his clone disappeared by a spike from the earth and his memories of their fight poured back to him, the charging Kakashi and Toraku leaning against a tree trunk to support his weight in the background. A violent scream echoed in the clearing as Kakashi slammed his hand onto the ground and sent a Raiton, Jibashi, lightning style, earth flash, jutsu toward the remaining Iwa shinobi. The commander froze in space as he turned to see his last comrade fall limply to the ground with an inhuman shout. He immediately turned around and charged toward Kakashi and Toraku, his hands forming seals with blurring speed, while he simply jumped over the stunned toad. He leaped into the air and slammed his hands onto the ground, sending his last bit of chakra into the soil. Doton, Sando no Jutsu, Earth Release, Mountainous Earth Technique. The earth cracked in half between the two young and weary shinobi, and two enormous rock formations appeared in order to close around and smash them to pieces. Only the Sannin's quick reflexes, shooting Whitehair forward to push them out of the technique's range, saved the two boys from becoming as thin as a pancake. A defeated roar left the commander's mouth as he fell to his knees, his body trembling from the strain and the chakra exhaustion. Jiraiya was breathing heavily as he wiped some blood from his forehead while glancing toward the two boys. Toraku limped toward them, leaning on Kakashi's shoulders, until they reached the stock-still laying and panting form of the commander. That was a very nasty technique. Jiraiya stated coldly, eyeing the scratches and cuts on Kakashi and the obviously more aware eyes of Toraku, who slowly lowered himself to the ground to sit down, hanging into the jounin's arm for support. What the heck did you give me? It's so damn annoying. I'm going to kill you. Kitsuchi hissed between his teeth, however he wasn't able to move even a finger. He put his last bit of chakra into that last technique and every part of his body felt numb and alien. You should know when to give up. Jiraiya stated calmly while he worked to secure the enemy ninja with wires. Kitsuchi's eyes flared with burning hatred, as they moved from Toraku to Kakashi and back. I'm going to kill you. Toraku narrowed his eyes as he glanced at the commander. What did we even do to you? Geez. Stone and fire are in the middle of a peace talk. You killed them. All of your comrades are alive, they're just knocked out. Toraku stated calmly, while he examined a nasty bruise on his side, hissing when his fingers touched his probably broken ribs. He shook his head again and blinked and dizziness started to appear again in his mind. You killed them. The blonde's eyes twitched. We didn't kill anyone, so just shut up, the always stoic Kakashi burst out as the gathering tension broke his mental walls. You were the one who killed them 3 months ago. You and your damn Hokage. The flares of hatred almost glowed in his eyes as he attempted to lunge toward Kakashi, who narrowed his eyes next to the Sannin. Hatake Kakashi and your damn Hokage. You were the one who killed my brother-in-law at the Kanobi Bridge. It was you. And your damn Hokage slaughtered my wife on the front lines on the same day. Kakashi obviously flinched and he slowly turned his head away from the commander. I killed, because if I hadn't then I would have been killed. Same. With sensei. We are shinobi. He stated calmly, but the IWA ninja didn't bother to even listen to the young jounin. His mind became foggy as anger and hatred took over the rational part of his mind, shouting away his pain to the world. I hope you remember him. His name was Kako. Remember his name for the rest of your pathetic life. Kako. He and his team were sent out to scout. He had black eyes and thick, shaggy brown hair. I hope his 2 blades made that scar on your face. Life for life. I will kill you, and that blonde. Your Hokage took away my wife, and I will take away his relative. Kakashi's muscle tensed and he narrowed his eyes. A small tremble ran down his spine and he felt rage and hatred rising inside him, bubbling and burning away everything of the outside world, as the realization hit him hard. I will remember your brother-in-law for the rest of my life, but not because you told me to. His Sharingan glowed dangerously and the tomos started to spin menacingly. Kakashi suddenly burst forward, his short sword entered to the ground a millimeter from Kitsuchi's throat as the jounin slammed it into the soil. His hands shaking from his emotions, his whole body trembled unstoppably and his sword draw a thin red line on the commander's neck by the movement. He killed my comrade. My best friend, the person who I looked at like he was my brother and I didn't even get the opportunity to tell him so. Life for life you said? Kakashi's voice was ice cold, full of the same burning and boiling hatred as the IWA nin, which sent chills down Toriku's spine. Will it be an equivalent if I kill you? Just do it. The commander narrowed his eyes and split out the word like it was sour poison and in the end chuckled insanely. Jiraiya folded his hands in front of his chest and his eyes darkened as he watched the flames of pure hatred in the eyes both Kitsuchi and Kakashi. The Sannin stepped forward, opening his mouth to interfere, but before he could say anything, something inside forced him to stop as he met the azure blue orbs of Toriku. Kakashi slowly pulled out his katana from the ground to make one more, this time precise, cut with it. You'll let him kill you? You'd throw away your own life that easily? The IWA nin blinked and a spark of consciousness returned to his haunted eyes and Kakashi stopped his movement. Toriku slowly raised himself from the ground, his legs wobbled as he leaned on his knees to support himself before he straightened and stood above the prostrate commander and the crouching Kakashi. And what would happen if Kakashi kills you? Will that bring back Obito? Or maybe your brother-in-law will be resurrected? Or your wife? You know what will happen? I know. Your relatives will swear vengeance on killing him. If they kill him, his friends will go after your relatives. And so on. Hatred only give birth to death which in the end will bear more hatred. Only peace can stop this never-ending circle. Jiraiya narrowed his eyes. While Kakashi eventually calmed down his nerves, which were stretched to the breaking point. His hands never left his katana, but the killing intent he emitted slowly dissipated. Kitsuchi forced his sore muscles to move and turned his head to look up at the blonde shinobi. He locked his dark eyes with the cerulean orbs to find sadness on his face and pity in his eyes. It doesn't matter. You speak of peace. There won't be any peace. There is no such thing as peace. Toriku stayed silent for a long minute, carefully examining the haunted eyes of the commander, the eyes, burning with the flames of hatred, melting away everything else as he saw Minato's face despite the differences. A soft smile ran across his features, a soft and caring smile, which only a mother could show to her own child. The IWA commander blinked in surprise. The smile disappeared from his face and sheer determination replaced it, flaring unstoppably in his azure blue orbs like a sapphire inferno. There is peace. Toriku's voice was firm, yet soft, echoing, yet still quiet, harsh, but still pleasant like a lullaby. I'll break the cycle of hatred. I'll break this curse. If there is such a thing as peace, I'll find it. Believe in me. I won't give up. Jiraiya distantly felt somewhere that his hands had fallen limply to his side and his lips parted in his surprise and awe. The commander blinked once more in confusion. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Toraku glanced down calmly at their captive, his azure orbs never let go of the determination for a long silent minute. The silence suddenly broke when the determination disappeared from his face, replaced by his well-known foxy grin. Jiraiya sighed, but a thought never left his mind. A thought from a prophecy, about one of his students. Well, he was actually a Junin sensei. A sensei of Toraku who was technically his student. Toraku suddenly froze. His arms don't move, although he wanted to grab his temper and scream as something cracked in his head and started to burn like an inferno, tearing his brain to shreds, bubbling and melting away his sanity. The pain suddenly stopped as fast as it came and the only thing he felt was sheer exhaustion. He distantly sensed his knees give up holding his weight and his body slowly falling to hit the hard. He didn't feel the pain of the impact. He sluggishly opened his eyes, turning his head as he calmly realized that he had passed out from exhaustion. He was again inside the never-ending sewer in the ankle-deep water. He slowly shook his head and stood up. His body almost cheerfully began to march toward his final destination where he would find that damn old rusty door without a handle and in the end he would drown in the ice-cold water. But he didn't care anymore. Somehow he felt happy and calm beyond words. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to like and subscribe, and don't forget to share this video with your friends. Guys, make sure to help the author by visiting the link in the description. This is Fox Sage, and I'm signing off.